Well, welcome everyone to Daf Yomi, 1 week at a time, Masechet Gittin. This is our 12th class for this Masechet, and today we are going to be reviewing Daf 79 through 85. And we are going to begin on Daf 79 at the Mishnah. The Mishnah tells us, if you remember last week, we were discussing the husband throwing the get towards the wife and it having to land in her domain. So we're continuing with this idea. Again, as I mentioned last week, it's important to understand that nowadays this is not valid. So no throwing anything at anybody. This does not work. But in the times of the Gemara, it theoretically worked. So the Mishnah tells us on Daf 39 that if the husband stands in his own courtyard and he throws the get up to his wife and she's on the roof and she's on her roof, right? So he's down at the bottom and she's up on top. As soon as it's in the airspace of her roof, so then they're considered divorced. Let's say it's reversed. Let's say he was up on the roof. This would make a great movie, right? So he's on the roof and she's in the courtyard. Again, it's his roof and her courtyard. As soon as it left the roof's airspace, so then, right, and now it's in the airspace of the courtyard, so then they're divorced. And why do we care? We care, but what's the issue here? Because let's say it got burnt up on its way down, or it got erased. Let's say it was raining and the ink got erased. So then the Gemara says, as soon as it hits, it doesn't have to hit the ground, right? Again, remember we said it has to be in her possession. Her possession could be her domain. We might think that it actually has to hit the ground. This Mishnah teaches us that it's as long as it's in the airspace of her domain, so then she is divorced, even if it doesn't land. Okay, so now the Gemara says only, right, let's go to the first case. He throws it up to the roof. Only if the roof is fenced in, right, or if it's guarded, right? We talked about this idea of a courtyard having a fence, therefore it's guarded, therefore it acquires the get for her. So if the roof is fenced in, or if it gets within 3 tfachim of the surface of the ground, right? If you remember, we learned in Masechet Sukkah that if something is within 3 handbreadths of a surface, it's as if it's resting on the surface. So then either one of those things works. Okay, right, because if not, we might say, like, let's say it's in the airspace of the roof, maybe the wind can blow it away and it never will land. So we have to make sure that it gets within the fence or within 3 tfachim of the ground in order to say that it was destined to land. Let's say he threw it down to her. Again, the courtyard walls need to be higher than the roof because we said it has to go into her domain. Therefore, it has to be that the walls are taller than the roof. So the Gemara explains that our Mishnah is like Rebbe, who says that the airspace is like it came to rest. Remember, as I said, the get needs to be in her domain. The way it would be in her domain is if it came to rest on the floor. The fact that it just goes into the airspace is okay if it's guarded. Sorry, 1 second. Okay. Okay. So now the Gemara brings where we learned a lot of these concepts, which was Masechet Shabbat, meaning what defines the domain and what defines throwing something from one domain to another. So in Shabbat, right, so as we said, is airspace considered coming to rest or not? Rabbanan said that, Rabbanan said that, that for get, they do agree that it is airspace, but they argue about it for Shabbat when we're dealing with Hilchot Shabbat. So it seems that they're making a distinction between a domain in terms of the laws of Shabbat versus the laws of get. Um, the get is valid only if it's erased on the way down. But right, again, think of it as like an arc, right? So if you throw something from the roof to the floor, so generally you throw it up and then it goes down. So if it gets erased on its way up, that doesn't count. But if it gets erased on the way down, so then we view it as on its way towards the wife, and then it would be valid. Right now, the Gemara talks about a fire. If we mentioned before that if it gets burnt up in the fire before it hits the ground, it might still be valid. The Gemara says if the fire started before the husband threw the get, so then it's invalid because it was never going to hit the floor. It was always going to be burnt up. But if the fire started after, right, after the get was thrown, when the husband actually threw the get, the assumption was that it was going to land. And then all of a sudden came a fire, that would still, the get would be valid. If the husband lends that wife space in order to acquire the get, that only works for that space, not all the property, not all his property, but that specific area that was his. And now we have 3 different laws about domains with regard to get, as opposed to with regard to Shabbat. Again, as we mentioned, the laws are similar, but here are the differences. We have a machloket in the laws of Shabbat with the fact of things that are, again, going through airspace. And that's what we mentioned, that here for get, the airspace needs to be guarded, meaning there needs to be walls or a fence, then it would be okay. For Shabbat, not necessarily. Let's say we have a pole in the courtyard, and then we have a tray on top of the pole. If you threw something from the public domain, the Reshut HaRabim, and it landed on this tray, you would be seen as liable for Shabbat, but for get, it would not work because the tray is higher than the walls of the area, and therefore it's not seen as being guarded, and therefore it would not be valid for a get. The next rule is that for Shabbat, you can't move something from one roof to another, an adjacent roof, if it's owned by 2 separate people, because it's seen as 2 different domains. But for get, if the husband lends the wife the other roof, so then he could put the get from his roof to her roof, and it is seen as 2 separate domains, but right, his and hers, and it would work. The last idea for this concept is having an inner courtyard and an outer courtyard. Let's say the inner courtyard is hers, and it's surrounded by an outer courtyard, which is his. And the outer courtyard walls are taller, right? So they're tall, and then the inner courtyard has shorter walls. So now, as soon as the get goes into her airspace, she's seen as divorced. because the outer walls, even though they're his walls, they protect the inner courtyard as well. And therefore, it just has to get into the airspace of her domain, and then she would be seen as divorced. But if it's like a box within a box, then it's only hers when it lands right in that box, as opposed to the airspace of the courtyard. Let's go to the next Mishnah. We have a machloket between Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai. Beit Shammai say you can use an old get. We'll explain what that means. And Beit Hillel say you cannot use an old get. So the Mishnah explains, not only that, right? If he was alone with his wife after he wrote a get, but before he gave it, so that would be an old get, meaning he had it, but he didn't give it to her yet, but then they were together, or alone without, without anyone there with them. And then the question is, did he like nullify the get? So the Gemara explains the machloket is, if we're concerned that maybe she'll have gotten pregnant, and then people will think that the child was conceived after out of wedlock, because again, the date on the get is earlier than when they actually got divorced. If you remember, the date is very important, and if they're together after the date of the get, again, there's a machloket if it's valid or not. The next Mishnah on Daf 79 tells us that if the date or any other detail was written wrong on the get, so now it's called a defective get, and it cannot be used. If she subsequently got remarried based on this defective get, so now she has to leave basically both men, meaning she has to get divorced from the first and the second husband. And right, she has to get a get from both of them. And the Mishnah now lists a whole list of consequences, all of them being detrimental, right? So she doesn't get her ktuva money, because we want her to get divorced from both men, and the money might impede that, and therefore she doesn't get the ktuva money. And here the idea is she shouldn't have gotten remarried after the defective get. And here the idea is that when the woman receives her get, she needs to be extremely careful to make sure that it's valid. If she can't tell, she should take it to court, she should take it to somebody to check, because if she gets remarried with this invalid get, she's going to get very messed up, right? We're going to see more than that. She doesn't get her support, mizonot. She doesn't get support from the husband. She doesn't get the clothing from the marriage. The children from either husband are seen as mamzerim, because what's the problem? She was never really divorced from the first husband. Now she marries the second husband. If she had children, she's actually married to somebody else. That creates a mamzer. So this is very, very serious. And basically, they weren't considered married. Therefore, if he's a Kohen, so then it's not like she's his wife, so he doesn't become impure for her if she dies. They don't get her earnings because he's not married to her. And she can't marry a Kohen after this whole episode because she's seen as having committed adultery with the second man. She needs to do chalitza, right now back to Yibum, she needs to do chalitza with either brother, because again, she's married, but she's not married. Daf 80 tells us that if the scribe wrote the wrong name or the wrong city, also all the things we just mentioned happen. Meaning, if there's something wrong in the get, and then she goes and gets remarried, So then all the consequences that we just mentioned go into effect. So someone says, right, Zora's asking, after the first divorce, whether valid or not, how could she marry a Kohen? The point is, if the first husband and even the second husband, if they die before they get divorced, so then she's seen as a widow and not a divorcee. And then she would be able to marry a Kohen, except for the fact that there was a big balagan, as they say in Hebrew. Okay. Now, yes, a big mess. Thank you, Zohar. Okay, another case, in the case of Yibum, let's say if you remember, right, we had a wife and we had a co-wife in Masechet Yivamot. If you remember, we learned that if one of the women is forbidden, is an erva, is a forbidden relationship to the husband or to the brother, so then not only does she not do Yibum, but also her co-wife. If you remember, it was called the tzara of the erva, right? The co-wife of a woman who was a forbidden relationship. So let's say the co-wife of one of these women goes and marries someone because she's exempt from doing Yibum. And then the original wife, the one who was forbidden, she's, let's say the sister-in-law or the sister of right, the sister of his wife or one of those things. Let's say she turns out to be an ilonit. If you remember, ilonit meant a woman who cannot have children, doesn't have secondary sexual signs. So let's say she turns out to be an ilonit. That means that the co-wife really did need to do yibum or chalitza, and therefore, but now she marries somebody else, which she wasn't allowed to do. So now she has to get a get from the second husband, and then she does chalitza with the brother, and all of the effects that we mentioned before happen as well to her. Let's say the brother does yibum, and then the co-wife marries someone else. And again, the original wife becomes, we find out that she's an ilonit. So now again, that co-wife needed to do yibum. Again, the same thing. Let's say the scribe gave the get to the man and the receipt to the woman. Now, that's not how it goes, right? The get has to go to the woman and the receipt goes to the man. Let's say, and now she's holding the receipt, right? She never got the get. If she marries somebody else based on that, again, she has to get divorced from both of them. And again, all of those consequences. Or maybe they really were divorced and now they're tricking everybody. And the Gemara is going to talk about this. So now let's get to the Gemara. The Gemara tells us that there was a decree to write the year based on the local monarch in specific places in order to foster peace. But if they made a mistake, so then it affects the validity of the get, right? If they wrote the wrong monarch, if they wrote the wrong date. If the scribe needs to record where he's writing the get, even if it's going to be given in another city, because that's going to determine how you define the date in the get. According to the rabbis, the get can be dated by any date, not only the local monarch, but if the scribe wrote the wrong name or the wrong place, if she gets remarried based on this, as we said, the child is a mamzer. Now, there's a machloket if a woman who's waiting to do yibum, if you remember, she's called shomeret yavam. So if she has relations with someone, is she forbidden to to do yibum, basically, right? If she was with someone in the meantime. Our Mishnah seems to say, no, she's not forbidden. She could still do yibum. Or maybe, yes, meaning she is she is forbidden from doing yibum. If the scribe gave the wrong document to the husband and the wife, but they're still discussing the divorce, meaning they haven't left the room yet, so then it's considered immediate, and they're not seen as divorced. He has to take it back and give it to the right person. But if they got up or they left the room, right, if it's the next day or a week later, so then we suspect that maybe there's some trickery going on, and we assume that really they're divorced. Or we define immediate is that she didn't get remarried, and therefore he has to give her another get. And later means she already did get married, and we assume that they were divorced. Okay, next daf 81, we have a new Mishnah. If a man wrote a get, but then changed his mind before giving the get, right? So he says, you know what, never mind, I don't want to get divorced. So Beit Shammai says that she can't marry a Kohen, meaning there's what's called a kol, like a voice, we'll see the idea of a rumor in a minute, but there's this idea that there was divorce that was discussed, and therefore, even if they don't actually get divorced, she would be considered a divorcee vis-a-vis a Kohen, meaning if the first husband dies, for a Kohen, she's considered a divorcee and not a widow. Beit Hillel say, no, even if he gave her a get, but there was a condition on the get, and the condition wasn't fulfilled, she's not considered a divorcee unless everything, all the boxes are checked, right? So, and therefore she can marry a Kohen. So that's the machloket. So the Gemara explains what happens if there's word going around. Again, as I mentioned, this idea of a rumor. Let's say there's word going around that a Kohen divorced his wife, but now they're seen living together. Do we assume that they never got divorced? Because if they do get divorced, it's important to understand that they cannot get remarried, because now the Kohen cannot marry a divorcee, even if it's his own, right? So let's say they're seen living together, but there's a rumor that they got divorced. So she needs to leave him, meaning we give validity to rumors. It's important to understand rumor just doesn't mean one person said it, but everyone's talking about it, and therefore she must leave him. The Gemara says we have to investigate if giving a get in that town actually means they wrote it, and therefore that's not the same thing as giving, and therefore she wouldn't have to leave him. Or does it mean that he actually gave it to her, and therefore they really are divorced? We actually are concerned, as I mentioned, about rumors, but especially rumors that have to do with betrothal and divorce. But if the rumor starts and she's already married to somebody else, we don't listen to the rumors. And therefore, as I said, she could stay married to the Kohen. But if he dies and she marries another Kohen, so now she does need to leave him, because the rumor started before she married the second person, and therefore she has to leave him. The Gemara comments on how careful Beit Shammai, how careful Beit Shammai is in the early generations, that they were so careful about family purity that he wouldn't let again, the woman, if there's a rumor that she was divorced, he wouldn't let her remain with the husband. But in the later generations, they would allow a woman who was captured to, when she was released, to remain with her husband, even if he was a Kohen. So it seems that the earlier generations were much more stringent, and the later generations were much more lenient. Interesting to understand, is that a good thing or a bad thing? I think the pshat of the Gemara is saying that it was better earlier in the old days, as they say, but it's not clear which one they see as better. And since we're talking in this way, so it says, right, the earlier generations were careful about wanting to perform mitzvot, so they would make sure that they brought the produce in the regular way, so that it would be they would have to separate the trumot and maasrot. But in later generations, they would actually bring it in through the roof, so that they can keep it exempt from separating trumot and maasrot. Okay, next Mishnah. You'll see, right, as we know, when we get to the end of the Masechet, which we're very close to the end, we have a lot of Mishnayot. A lot of them are very fundamental to the concept of get. So now the Gemara says, if the husband divorced her and then they stayed in an inn together, Beit Shammai says that she does not need a second get. They're seen as, they can use that original get. The assumption is that they had relations in this inn. Beit Hillel say that she needs another get, because if they slept together, it means that, right, maybe they're reconciling. However, if they got divorced from Erusin, from being betrothed, right? If you remember, we've learned that when you are betrothed, it's almost like getting married, and you actually need a get to break up that relationship. Again, it's not like nowadays engaged. This is by doing Erusin, which is Harei at Mitzudeshet li. We're going to talk about that in the next Masechet. If they were divorced from Erusin and then from betrothal, and then they were together in an inn, we don't have to be concerned that they had relations, because they haven't been officially married yet. The Gemara says the machloket is only when there are actually witnesses that say that they did sleep together. And here the machloket is when a husband and wife, when a man and woman sleep together, do we assume that it is with having in mind that they want to be married, and therefore it's a negation of the get, and therefore she would need a second get? Or do we say they were just together and not? The way the Gemara discusses it is, does a person have bi'ah, relations, l'shem znut? Znut means, right, in a promiscuous way, or is it l'shem kiddushin, or is it in a sanctified way? But here it means because they want to have a relationship. So that is the question. So the question basically here is the Mishnah discussing where there are witnesses that they had relations, or not, that they didn't? We don't know if they had relations, and then we assume if they were married before, we assume that they actually did have relations. If they were just engaged, we assume that they did not have relations. And that is the discussion in this Mishnah. Okay, the next Mishnah discusses something called a get mikushar. Mikushar means tied. We're going to see that for certain people, specifically for Kohanim, because once the Kohen gets divorced, he cannot remarry his original wife. We really want to make sure that he wants to get divorced. So what they would do is they would write the get either in increments or twice. Then they would fold it and like sew it, and then have signatures sign it, people sign it, then fold it again and have them sign, other people come and sign it. But the idea is to make the process longer, because maybe the Kohen just they got in a fight and he's like, that's it, we're getting divorced. And they're like, are you sure? Are you sure? Are you sure? So here, that's called a get mikushar. We're going to see that the minimum number of folds is 3. And now the Mishnah tells us that if one of the folds is missing a signature, so then it's called a bald get, a get kereach, right? It's missing something. Now, if a woman gets remarried based on this get kereach, the get that's missing a signature, so then she has to leave the second husband because she's not allowed to be married to him. And again, all the things that we mentioned above. Then the Mishnah tells us that anyone can sign this get kereach in order to make it valid. Maybe it doesn't even have to be a valid witness, or only, right, meaning not someone like a slave or someone who can never be a witness. Maybe they can't sign it, but maybe a relative who's a valid witness for anybody else, just not for this thing. So maybe they can sign it. Again, these signatures are not an inherent part of the document, which we'll see in a minute. So now the Gemara explains that this bald get is invalid because maybe the husband said, all of you need to sign the get, and now somebody didn't sign it, and then it would really be invalid. Therefore, we say anytime it's missing a signature, we say that it is invalid. As I mentioned, a slave can't sign this document according to Rabbi Akiva, because then people will think that maybe the person is free, right? If he signed it, then maybe he can use it as proof that he was freed. But if everyone knows who's my brother or who's my sister, so then that would be okay. As we said, if there are 3 folds and 2 signatures, so now everyone agrees that the 3rd signature can only be either a valid witness or a relative. It can't be anybody else. And this relative can sign on any one of the folds. It doesn't have to be the first or the last or the middle. It doesn't matter. Daf 82 tells us that you actually can use a slave as one of the signatures on this get, and it would be valid. And with that, we finish the 8th chapter, and now we are going to begin the final chapter of Masechet Gittin. So now we're going to learn, it says in the Torah that a get is called, the Torah says, V'katav la get fritut. He has to write for her a get, a document that is koret, which means that severs, like from the word karet, right? Karet is the punishment of the most severe punishment, which is basically that the soul is cut off from the Jewish people. So kritut means cut off. So the Mishnah is going to explain that the get must sever the relationship between the husband and wife. And if it does not sever the relationship, it is invalid. So the Mishnah says that if a man says, you can marry anyone, right, here's your get, you can marry anyone except for so-and-so, right? I don't like the way he looked at you, you can never marry him. So Rabbi Eliezer says that that is a valid get. We'll see why in a minute. And Chachamim say it is invalid. However, again, this was verbal. He could take the get back and then give it to her again and say, you can marry whoever you want. But if he actually wrote it in the get, so now it's invalid, even if he erases it, because once he writes it, that's it. Okay, so now the Gemara explains, how does this work? Right, when he says you can marry anyone but that person, right, Ella, right, but that person, does it mean except, even though I use the word except, but does it mean chutz mi, right? Does it mean accept that person, or does it mean on condition that you don't marry that person? If you remember in the last chapter, we learned that the husband is allowed to make conditions, but he cannot say you're permitted to anyone except for that person. That doesn't work. Right? Accept, the word accept is invalid, but a condition might be valid, or no. Do they argue if it's a condition, right? But everyone agrees that if you say accept, so then it's invalid. So that's the question here. There's a braita that says that there's a machloket when he says on condition that, right, that maybe it would be valid like any other condition, or it's invalid because, as we mentioned, it doesn't completely sever their relationship. Her whole life, she's not allowed to marry so-and-so. That's not okay, right? Once they're divorced, he cannot have any control over her life. Okay, right now the Gemara asks, since we're talking about get, the Gemara asks the other side of the coin, which is kiddushin, which is betrothal, right? Our next masachet, right? So what about betrothal? Can there be an accept with betrothal, right? You are betrothed to me, which means you can't marry anybody else. You're now mine, except for so-and-so. Why you would do this is not clear to me. But let's say you said that. So does it work or no? Once you betroth someone, she should be forbidden to everyone except for this person. Right? Some say because the verse teaches that in the same verse that it talks about her getting divorced, it also talks about her getting married, and therefore they're linked. Are they linked completely? And therefore all the laws of divorce are the same for the laws of betrothal, or not necessarily? And now there's a strange case where one brother betroths the woman and says, you cannot marry anybody else, right? I want you to be mine, except for my brother, Shimon. And then Shimon says the same thing, except for Reuven. And then they both die. So then she actually does yibum with Levi, who's a third brother. It's a very complicated situation. But this seems to imply that there is such thing as this partial betrothal. But let's say he says, let's say the husband says, you are permitted, again, he's getting divorced. He says, you're permitted to everyone except for these two people, Reuven and Shimon, right? I don't like those guys. But then when he gives her the get, he says, you're permitted to Reuven and Shimon. So now the Gemara asks, is she permitted to everyone and Reuven and Shimon? Or is she permitted only to Reuven and Shimon and not anybody else? Daf 83 says, what if he just says she's permitted to just Reuven or just Shimon? So the Gemara ends with teku. We do not have an answer for those questions. So if you remember in the Mishnah, Rabbi Eliezer said that this exception is like a condition and therefore it's valid. So when Rabbi Eliezer died, there were 4 sages who refuted his ruling, and the Gemara lists each one, right? So, and it gives examples that, let's say, right, if the wife married the brother of the man, again, he says, the husband says, you're divorced, you can marry everyone except for Reuven. Now, right, so the Gemara says, well, wait a minute. What if, right, she's not allowed to marry Reuven, right? But now, let's say she marries Reuven's brother, and then he dies, and now she needs to do yibum with Reuven. So it would turn out that the original husband is forbidding her to do yibum, and we know that you can't do that. Therefore, it's as if, right, there was no severance of the marriage, and therefore it shouldn't be valid. Another refutation is that we don't have a concept of being forbidden to everyone except for one person, or being permitted to everyone except for one person. There's no such thing, and therefore it shouldn't be valid. Again, as we mentioned, constitutes, the divorce needs to completely sever the relationship, and here we don't have that. And the last refutation is that, let's say she went and married somebody else, and then she had children, and then the second husband died, or she got divorced, and then she went and married Reuven, the man she wasn't allowed to marry. So then, if she marries that guy, retroactively, the divorce becomes invalid, and now her children from husband number 2 would be mamzerim, and we don't want that to happen. So therefore, it shouldn't be a valid thing that could happen. Rabbi Eliezer says, the Gemara says that Rabbi Eliezer could have refuted all of these ideas. And really, Rabbi Eliezer would let her marry the forbidden man if she married his brother in the meantime, right? Maybe if she married someone in between, maybe then it would be okay. And the Gemara goes through each one of these cases and shows how it would be valid or invalid. And the same thing with betrothal, right? A woman's status before her second betrothal should be like her status before the first betrothal. She should be permitted to everyone. And here we don't have that, that possibility. Okay, as we said, right, a man cannot make a condition on a get if it's unlimited, right? This is your get if you never drink wine. He cannot control what she does for the rest of her life, but he could say for the next 30 days you can't drink wine, and then this is your get. That is valid because it's limited. Let's say, right, you can't drink wine for the rest of your life, we said is invalid. But if he says for all the days of my life, right, the husband, so then that would be valid because he'll die and then she can have wine. Let's say the husband said, today we're divorced, but tomorrow we're going to be married again, right? Does that work, right? Does divorce need to be forever, or not necessarily? And we say, no, the divorce is valid, but they're not remarried the next day, right? There's no such thing as going back to being married after that. Daf 84 tells us, let's say the husband said, this is your get if you marry so-and-so, right? That she has to marry so-and-so. That does not work. She cannot marry so-and-so. We do not want her, right? We do not want him to be able to control what she can or cannot do, as we mentioned before. Or another option is that if she marries that man, that actually she could stay married to him, meaning that he does not have control over her. Or maybe she can marry another man because maybe in the future she will marry that guy, and then retroactively she'll have been divorced, right? It's going forward and backwards. It seems like we're using time travel. Or maybe she can't marry anyone till she marries that person. If the husband gives her a get with an impossible condition to fulfill, so then it is not valid. Or the Gemara says maybe it is valid. Maybe he's just trying to torture her, and that it would still be valid. What happens if the condition was against Jewish law, right? Let's say he says, this is we're going to be divorced if you eat pig, right? Or transgress the Shabbat. Some might say it works because physically she could eat the pig and she could decide what she wants to do. Or we say, no, right? Let's say he says, this is your get if you sleep with so-and-so. We say, no, that is invalid because it is forbidden. Or again, as we said, maybe it's physically possible and therefore it would be valid. So that's the machloket in the Gemara. The Gemara gives other examples of conditions that could be valid or not. Right? Again, maybe these things are valid because she would do a forbidden thing while he made the condition, and therefore it works, or maybe not. Let's say he made a bad condition. He can take back the get and then give it to her without that condition. When he gave it to her the first time, it was enough to make her forbidden to a Kohen. Remember, we said if there's some sort of like even a hint that they got divorced, she's seen as divorced to a Kohen, right? But if it didn't do anything, then he wouldn't need to take the get back. He can just say the valid statement, and then they would be divorced. If the husband made an oral stipulation before the main part, the torah, the main part of the get was written, so then it's invalid. Any condition written into the get invalidates the get, or maybe it invalidates maybe the condition invalidates it, but maybe only if it's an invalid condition does it invalidate the get. But if it's a valid condition, like we said last week, here's your get if you give me 200 zuz. That is a valid condition. It's not very nice, but you could do it. So then maybe it is okay. Daf 85, the last daf for today. We have the Mishnah tells us, let's say he says, you're permitted to everyone except for my father or your father, right? Or basically anyone else who's forbidden to her, right? He says she's forbidden to them. Well, she was already forbidden to them. So the Gemara says it's valid because the condition doesn't affect her. She was forbidden to her to sleep with her father beforehand, and now she's forbidden to sleep with her father afterwards. It doesn't matter. So it doesn't work. Meaning it doesn't matter. So the get does work. They're divorced. Let's say he says, you are permitted to everyone except for forbidden relationships, but these are a lower level of prohibition. They're just a negative commandment, as opposed to the other ones, which were correct. They were real, not real, but very serious forbidden relationships. So those are invalid conditions, even though they are forbidden. And the Gemara explains that the difference is the level of prohibition. If it's karet, which is very severe, versus just a negative prohibition. Let's say he says you're permitted to everyone except for this certain minor. Now, a minor cannot betroth a woman, so maybe this is completely invalid, but the minor can grow up and then he could propose to her, and therefore maybe it is valid. Let's say he says, again, you're divorced, you're permitted to anyone, except for those who aren't born yet, right? You can't marry anybody who's not born at this moment. Is this considered a limitation because they're going to be born in the future? So they are considered a limitation, as opposed to, let's say he says, right, what about a non-Jew? Maybe they'll convert, right? We don't know. Let's say he says you're permitted to everyone except for your sister's husband. Again, she's already forbidden to him, but if the sister dies, so then she really could marry him, and therefore this is considered a limitation. Again, as we mentioned, anything that's seen as a limitation would invalidate the get because it does not completely sever the relationship. Right, let's say he says, you're divorced, you can marry whoever you want, but you can't have relations before marriage. Again, this is limiting the relationship. And the question is, he's not limiting her ability to get married, but he is limiting her actions. Maybe that is okay, maybe it's not okay. Right? He can't retain the right, there's a machloket if he can retain the right to revoke her vows or to forbid her from eating truma. All of these cases, it says teku, and we leave it at, we don't know the resolution of these questions. The last Mishnah for today, the get must say, you are permitted to all men, as we mentioned before. Rabbi Yehuda says that it actually has to have other lines, right? We're completely, we're breaking off this relationship completely. It's completely severed. The essential part of a bill of emancipation, right, for a slave has to say, you are a free woman, or you are for yourself, le'atzmech. That's how you write a bill of emancipation. The Gemara says, even though we mentioned these two things together, you can't write the reverse, right? You can't tell a woman who's married, you're free, right? That's not the language for divorced, right? And you can't tell the slave, you're permitted to all men, right? That doesn't work either. You have to use the right words for the right situation. If he says, I have no dealings with you, that is valid for a slave. And here there's a machloket if a partial declaration is valid or not. And the Gemara describes how the words should be written so that you don't like literally how you spell each word, so that there shouldn't be a misunderstanding for the meaning of all the words in the get. And the Gemara ends by saying that you are required to add all those extra verses, all the extra lines for, as Rabbi Yehuda said, meaning not only you're permitted to all men, but I sever our ties, and that we no longer have a relationship anymore. I see we have a few minutes left. If anybody wants to ask any questions, that was a lot of information. We're always going to have a lot of information at the end of a masechet. As we've mentioned before, we get to a lot of fundamentals. I think this was the way the rabbis made sure that everyone reads to the end of the book. So there's always going to be a lot of information at the end. But again, if anybody has any questions, just also next week, regular time, regular schedule. Okay. So I'm going to stop the recording now, but then we can continue having a discussion if you would like. Wishing everyone a Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom. Okay.